You ready?
Yes. Shall we start now? Or?
Well, let me introduce everybody.
All right.
What's going to happen in the presentation.
Right. Yeah.
Welcome everybody. We're here for supporting Victor in his presentation for his master thesis, psychology. He's going to do work on risk perception and climate change. He went all the way to Indonesia to get some respondents.
Yeah.
Perhaps some of the respondents are in the audience as well, so you know basically what his study was all about. Today's procedure is quite simple. You're going to explain your study, your work, let's say in 20-25 minutes, and then it's time for questions and answers. We would appreciate you to have your questions ready, and the more difficult the questions are, the better it is. You understand that he gives a better answer to the difficult question. He is better graded for the aspect of the presentation for this afternoon. Perhaps my colleague and myself will have some questions as well. My colleague is Peter de Vries. My name is Jan Gutteling. We are the supervisors for Victor during his presentation. After we say, well, it's enough questions, difficult questions and simple answers, it's time for us to go and for the two of us to go to a different room to think a little bit about the grading for the presentation. You already talked about grading for the thesis. And then 5 minutes or so we come back, and then your diploma is already on the table there, and we hand it over to you, and then everything is okay. And it's time for having a party.
Yeah.
Okay, lots of success.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to my presentation today. I'm excited to present you my thesis project, which I have conducted in Indonesia several months ago. And
they should also be in here?
Yes. Can I just...
Yeah, sure.
Yes, thank you for coming. So I'll just continue. So this research is about risk perception of climate change in Indonesia and its relation to the cultural dimension introduced by host today. It is uncertainty avoidance, collectivism, and long-term orientation. In this presentation today, I will give you some explanation about what is risk perception, how the risk perception of climate change took place in Indonesia, and what is cultural dimensions, what is method results, and the conclusion of my research topic. First, I'm gonna explain you about risk. Of course, risks already happen in our life. I mean, every day we are dealing with risk, and risk perception is related to the individual evaluation of the negative consequences of hazard or any disasters or dangerous events in the future that we don't want it to be happen in our life as a person or our family. And there are many illustrations, very nice illustrations about how people perceive risk and what is actually the actual risk in society. We see here Susanna Hattrick has nicely depicted the research from Dr. Peter Sandman about how people or public outrage took place. Like we see here, like people put a lot of attention to the terrorist attack and plane crash as the cause of deaths in society as the bigger, but then actual hazard is not terrorist attack or plane crash, rather than cancer or car accident. So in society, people tend to misinterpret or bias by the actual or objective risk. And another example which related to the climate change issue here, also depicted by Susanna Hattrick, she explained or she depicted that the report from Reuters and US State Department has explained or reported that the number of deaths caused by climate change is actually higher, 300 times higher than the deaths caused by the terrorist attack here. We see the comparison is totally very different, very far. And in this situation, in society, we can assume that people actually tend to misinterpret or like bias in assessing the risk or the objective risk. Many factors can trigger the risk perception, but one of the theory I take here, like it is the theory of the society when we have three levels, like first is macro level, secondly is meso level, and micro level. Macro level is related to the big society, and it is related to the safety culture in society and safety leadership. So it is more about the regulation and norms in society we follow. And for the meso level, it is more about the less circle in our society, like peer groups. So everyone conform to their peer groups to be accepted. So if there's a value of safety there, maybe you will follow that as to be accepted in that society, in that peer groups. And the micro level, it is more about the personal level. It is more about the information or the level of knowledge you have about a situation or about the issue that you are facing currently. Okay. So, about the risk perception of climate change around the world, there is a Gallup report in 2007 and 2008 explain us in two maps the climate change awareness and the risk perception of climate change. We see here there are two maps. First map is about the climate change awareness, and the second map is about the risk perception of climate change. We see some countries here like United States, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Germany has more than 75% of the population aware about the issue of climate change, but when it comes to the climate change or risk perception of climate change, they have a very, let's say very low, that 50 to 69% in the United States, in Netherlands also, and in Germany, of the total aware population perceive it as a threat or risky situation. On the other hand, some countries like South Korea, Indonesia, India, Argentina, for example, they have a positive correlation of the climate change awareness and climate change or risk perception of climate change. We see here, South Korea and Argentina, for example, they have more than 75% of the population aware of the issue of climate change, and it's related or linear to the risk perception of climate change in that country. We see 80 to 90% in more than 90% in South Korea and Argentina, more than 90%. It also happens in Indonesia and India. Even they have less population to understand or to have information about climate change, but they have very high risk perception of climate change from the total aware population. Climate change around the world can be triggered by climate change around the world, especially the awareness, can be triggered by mostly education and communication access. This is the results from the Gallup World Poll in 2007-2008. We see here that climate change awareness is mostly triggered by the education and communication access. But when it comes to the risk perception, we see here that cause of global warming is actually caused by mostly caused by the cause of global warming itself. Cause of global warming itself is related to the human activities such as air pollution and water quality. When I come to Indonesia, I interviewed some of the residents there, and I asked them whether they know about the climate change issue or not, and some of them, they answered they know and they understand the climate change, but when it comes to what is the relation of climate change and the situation right now, and they answer me that the palm oil industry in their place, like in South Sumatra and Riau, is the most growing palm oil industry there. So they see climate change as the air being polluted by the industry, and you see here the sky is really cloudy there. So in Indonesia, we see here also that most of the cause of climate change, risk of climate change, is cause of global warming itself. And other variables that I will explain or try to relate to the climate change perception is the risk cultural dimension, which is introduced by Gert Hofstede. There are 6 cultural dimensions, but then I will just explain or just 3 cultural dimensions, which is well, first I will just give you brief explanation about what is cultural dimension. Okay, first is power distance. So power distance is related to the way people in low level society, they accept and expect that in society power is not distributed equally. So for example, in Indonesia, because we tend to be a country with high power distance, you are as a younger should respect or expected to respect older people, and you are not allowed to argue with them. Secondly is individualism versus collectivism. It is related more to the consideration of yourself as an individual, whether you are an independent individual or you are related to your primary group. You always consider yourself as a representation of your family or your small group. Thirdly is uncertainty avoidance. So uncertainty avoidance, the degree of comfortableness. So whether you're comfortable or not comfortable with ambiguity or uncertain situation in the future, if you tend to high uncertainty avoidance society, you tend to make a lot of regulation and make yourself comfort with a lot of regulation or rules, but it is not necessarily automatically that you follow the rules or you obey the rules. And there's also a short-term versus long-term orientation. This society differentiates by the focus on effort of the future, whether they focus on the life right now, they spend a lot of time or focus on effort right now, or they want to focus on the future, or they make plan for the future. One more is indulgence versus restraint society. In indulgence, you tend to be free speech, like there are a lot of gratification versus limitation of your desire. So if you are in the indulgent society, you tend to be freely speech in the public. You can speak whatever you want, but in restrained society, you are not allowed to do that. You are always limited to express your opinion in public. And this femininity versus masculinity explain us or differentiate society by the role division of men and women. What should women and men do? And I choose uncertainty avoidance. So there are examples here, but I think I already explained it. Here Indonesia has a moderate to high uncertainty avoidance, 48 score in index score, and collectivism also. Here Indonesia tend to be more collectivistic society by the index score 14 of individualism, and long-term orientation. You see here Indonesia tend to be more long-term oriented society. So I have actually some pictures here which related to the cultural dimension, but later I will explain if I have time. I think I will just go to the hypothesis of this research. So the hypothesis of this research is cultural dimensions, uncertainty avoidance, collectivism, and long-term orientation has positive relation or have positive relation to the risk perception of climate change, especially in Indonesia. I think the more the society perceive or collectivistic or uncertain avoidance society or long-term oriented society, the more they will perceive the risk of climate change. The method I use in my research, I use a Colloquium survey, online survey, and I got 706 participants, but then only around 500 participants completed the participation. And I directly visited some provinces in Indonesia: Riau, South Sumatra, Jakarta, West Java, Yogyakarta, West Java, South Sulawesi, and West Sulawesi. I visited some universities and I met students. I gave them the survey online and I asked them voluntarily to share the link survey to their social media, Facebook, email, or WhatsApp, and etc. Because in Indonesia, young people, they tend to have very active communication in social media. That's why I can get this number of participations. The survey question was administered in English previously, so I have to translate the survey to the Bahasa Indonesia, and I got this reliability score, which we see here. There are no less than 60% of Cronbach alpha coefficient. It means that these survey questions can measure properly these four variables. And the mean we see here, like uncertainty avoidance in Indonesia, we see, and long-term orientation, it's like it's slightly high, and not slightly high, pretty much high. And the collectivism and risk perception of climate change is moderate to high in Indonesia. Most of the participants, we see half of the participants are females with education level mostly from university, as I visited university, and the age range from 15 to 25% here, 15 to 25 years old. And the disaster experience, half of the samples have experienced the flood or the forest fire in their region. So I conducted a hierarchical multiple regression analysis. It is a regression analysis to check whether the additional variables like this demographic variable happen to be associated or have a significant impact to the predicting capacity of the risk perception of climate change as dependent variable. Here we can see that the R square less than 0% and the probability score around 75%, which means that the relation is, there's no relation about of the disaster experience, age, gender, and education to the risk perception of climate change. But when I added long-term orientation, collectivism, uncertainty avoidance to the survey, to the analysis, we can see that the R square jumped to 20% and the probability become less than 1%, meaning that long-term orientation, collectivism, and uncertainty avoidance have a significant positive correlation to the risk perception of climate change. First, we see that gender, age, disaster experience, education level has no relation to the risk perception of climate change. It can be explained by the previous findings or research, which explain that gender has no effect on process of fear appealing process. That's the research finding that strengthened my research here. And about the age range, maybe we assume that people from older people will perceive risk more than the younger people in society. But when it comes to because risk has many domains. One of domains in health domains risk is specifically environmental risk. People cannot control the situation, especially if it's related to the disaster or environmental situation. So people from different age group, will perceive similarly the risk perception of environmental issue because they cannot control, or it tends to be unavoidable. In disaster experience, I have found cross-effect disaster research that saying that if you want to perceive risk of a particular disaster, you have to experience previously the similar context of the disaster. It means that if you want to perceive the risk of flood, you have to experience also the flood in the past, so you will have a risk perception of flood. So when it comes to the risk perception of climate change, especially Indonesia, we see previously that in Indonesia, people perceive the climate change related to the air pollution or the water quality. It's not related to disaster. That's why we see here that people in Indonesia cannot relate the disaster experience, especially flood and forest fire, to the climate change. And education level, we see that in education level, it's not the matter of determining the risk perception, because when it comes to the education, you have to have the specialization in environmental studies, for example, or climate change, to have a risk perception of climate change, but not education level. It's more about the speciality. Here is the main focus of this research. We found that uncertainty avoidance, collectivism, and long-term orientation has positive relation to the risk perception of climate change. We see that the p-value less than 1% here. And long-term orientation dimension has a highest contribution to the risk perception of climate change. As we see here, the coefficient beta 0.612, which means that the conclusion of my research study is that cultural dimension of uncertainty avoidance, collectivism, and long-term orientation has positive correlation to the risk perception of climate change. It means that when the society have uncertainty avoidance, high uncertainty avoidance, high collectivistic society, or long-term oriented society, they tend to perceive risk of climate change also higher. And this research have never been conducted previously, especially in Indonesia. And there are many research about climate change, but they related to the politics or economy situation. But in culture, we already found that actually cultural differences or cultural dimension also have an impact to the risk perception of climate change. And this result hopefully that will represent new finding in countries like Indonesia, for example, in Southeast Asia countries which have a similar characteristics to Indonesia, and we can maybe assume that that those countries will also have level of risk perception of climate change. And this result will also contribute to the recommendation maybe to the authority, to the government, to design the effective risk communication in society, so they will have a more significant result of the risk communication in society. That's all my presentation today. If you have questions, please do, and I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
I have several questions. Can I ask more than two? Again, the beginning, I don't remember which slide it was. Can you explain about the difference of the blue and red zone in the maps you have shown before? And what do those maps tell us about? The second one is, what are the reasons of you picking up 3 cultural dimensions as the variables? I know you make those 3 variables as the hypothesis that those 3 are positively correlated to the risk perception, but why did you choose those 3 out of 6 cultural dimensions you mentioned before? The third one is, what makes you choose? No, sorry. What made you choose several provinces as the target? Are there any like special cultural that we have to know, something like that? Next is.
Actually, you give Victor the time to answer the first
Okay.
question.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe is there any other question, or just answer her first?
Yeah.
So the maps that I explained previously is actually So the first map is climate change awareness. Is this one that you asked?
Yeah.
So climate change awareness is related to whether the society aware of the issue of climate change. So this is related to the information you have about climate change, but in this second map, it's related to the climate change perception or risk perception of climate change. When you're aware about the issue, it is not necessarily that you will perceive it as a threat in society. So you know that issue, you know that climate change is there, but you are not perceive it as a threat or something that will affect your life negatively. So in here, first we see is climate change awareness in some countries here. For example, like let's say United States here, they have more than 75% population aware of the issue. They know the climate change exists, but only 50 to 69 of the 75% population, aware population, perceive it as threat. So it means that it's not necessarily that when you have information, when you know the climate change, you will perceive it as a threat. So you will not, you tend to be avoiding the issue because you think that's not real. I mean, that's not affect me negative. That's this map talking about. And secondly, what reason cultural dimension? I picked the 3 cultural dimension because those 3 cultural dimension is more here. Individualism and collectivism, short-term and long-term orientation, and uncertainty avoidance. It's more related to the individual characteristic. You can measure it in individual level, but when it comes to the power distance and masculinity versus femininity and indulgence versus restraint, it is more about social characteristic, the society characteristic. So it can't be measured properly in individual level because everyone will for example, in indulgence versus restraint, if you want to measure it, you have to know the level of safety in your country, in your region. And the level of safety in every region can be perceived can be hardly perceived because everyone will have, not everyone will have the information about the safety in their culture, in their society. So it is because more related to the characteristic of society. For example, here, indulgence versus restraint, masculinity versus femininity society. It is more related to the division of role in society. What should women do and what should men do? And if I ask you this question, you might have different perspective because you are, as an individual, they have a different opinion. But in the survey, I think if I use this masculinity versus femininity, it will be hard to measure in individual level, and secondly, it will has no relation also to the risk of climate change. If you talk about femininity, the division of role in family, for example, I think there is no relation to the climate change issue because it's more about the face validity here. It's more about the tendency of how can I predict uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and individualism versus collectivism to have an impact to the climate change awareness perception. Is it answering your question, or do you need more explanation?
No, I think I understand it now.
There's also a practical consideration.
Yeah.
If you want to measure 6 of those cultural dimensions, the questionnaire will be longer. It was at first hand it was not very clear how successful the data gathering capacity will be in total. So we said, well, perhaps you have to make a choice for the most important cultural dimensions, so that your questionnaire is more limited in size, and that might increase your number of respondents. A shorter questionnaire is completed by more people than a longer questionnaire. It's a simple matter of fact.
Thank you.